Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Franks, and the creation of Charlemagne's empire. Today is episode 1, the division of the Roman Empire and the creation of the Tetrarchy. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. It is important to remember that the huge expansion of the Roman Empire had basically ended around AD 43 when the Kingdom of Thrace, modern-day Bulgaria, was transformed into a Roman province. The northern borders of the empire became the Rhine and the Danube rivers. The western border would be the Atlantic, aside from Hadrian's Wall in England. The southern border was basically the desert edge beyond the North African coastline, and the eastern border, well, the eastern border was in Mesopotamia, but the exact border was disputed by the Sasanian Empire. The Roman Empire occupied every stretch of coastline of the Mediterranean, turning it into a Roman lake. These borders would not change for centuries. The Rhine and the Danube rivers were the borders because they made for clear borders and they enabled the supply of the troops guarding the borders. The Rhine River became a border because it was connected to the Mediterranean, well, through the Rhone and then a portage to the Moselle. Also, the wave of conquest had ended because the Germanic regions north of the Rhine were less developed and thus offered less wealth to exploit. Armies of conquest are not cheap, and the empire expected a return on its investment. The empire was not making a value judgment on the Germanic regions, it was just basic economics. As the empire expanded, it transformed the newly conquered regions. New towns and cities were built with private villas, public bathhouses, Latin grammar schools, amphitheaters, and government buildings. Every large market town in the empire had grammar schools. Obviously, the local elite sent their children to these schools, but anyone who wanted their children to enter the lower rungs of the elite hired grammarians to educate their children because that education was the requirement for a career in politics and the administration of the empire. It needs to be stressed that the Roman Empire was not changed by local cultures. The local cultures were transformed, or at least the elites and the urban dwellers were transformed into Romans. Undoubtedly, the Romans of Italy had a snobbish disdain for provincials, but they still all followed the same social structure. Basically, the children and the grandchildren of the people who had been conquered became Romans. As I said, the emperors had concluded that there was no need to expand beyond the existing borders so they could live in harmony with their neighbors, well, relative harmony. The question was, did their neighbors want to live in harmony with the empire? The answer is no. By the mid-3rd century, the Roman Empire had to deal with a young, aggressive Sasanian dynasty in Persia and increasingly organized Germanic tribes. Obviously, the mighty Roman Empire had nothing to fear from either the Persians or the Germanic tribes, since the empire would send a powerful army to discipline whoever attempted to invade. Not exactly. The empire was stretched thin. Admittedly, the empire possessed a remarkable ability to ensure that each new province followed the same urban planning, used the same currency, and spoke the same language. Well, the elites spoke Latin. However, the empire was experiencing increasing difficulty raising armies to support frontier provinces because the empire no longer functioned properly. The problem was at the top of the system, which had proved unable to ensure a stable succession from one emperor to another. In the period from 235 to 284, an endless stream of emperors ended their reign in blood, their blood, either dying on the battlefield or in a coup. To be fair, this was a gradual process lasting roughly 2 generations, but each coup or military defeat deepened the instability. Not counting usurpers who declared themselves emperor but were almost immediately eliminated by more successful rivals, there were 16 emperors in a period of 49 years. Gallienus, the longest, lasted 8 years, but he was an adolescent and a figurehead for much of his reign. Honestly, it is impressive that the empire held together during that period and did not break up into regions that focused on defending themselves. As the threat to the empire's survival grew, military men began to seize the throne, replacing senators who had grown up in Rome. Experienced with the provinces, they realized that Rome was located too far away from the frontiers, so they began to operate from sub-capitals like Milan in northern Italy and Antioch in the province of Syria. Actually, this shift made sense. Their authority came from the army, not the Senate, so why waste time in Rome? Rome was eclipsed by the new regional capitals like Milan, Trier, Byzantium, and Antioch because those cities had more convenient locations. But Rome also faded in importance because the Senate had faded in importance. The emperor's court was the center of influence, and the court followed the emperor. The senators had been replaced by two separate groups. The senior commanders of the armies assigned to guard the main frontiers, the Rhine, the Danube, and the border in Mesopotamia, and the senior bureaucrats who were based in the regional capitals of Trier, Milan, Byzantium, and Antioch. While the disorganized Germanic tribes were not a major threat, at least not for a century or two, the appearance of the Sasanian dynasty in 224 led to an actual organized rival that was a genuine threat. 2 emperors were killed and a third captured in wars against the Persians. The dynasty organized massive irrigation projects which produced greater tax revenue, which funded an army of conquest. So the Roman Empire needed a larger army. The key turning point occurred when Diocletian seized power when Emperor Carus died suddenly after gaining victory over the Persians in 283. In theory, Carus should have been succeeded by one of his sons, but a couple of assassinations ensured that the throne remained vacant. So Diocletian became emperor in 284. Busy with the Persians and an uprising in Egypt, Diocletian sent his trusted friend Maximus to deal with peasant revolts in Gaul. 2 years later, Diocletian legitimized the situation by naming him emperor and assigned him to govern the western part of the empire. In 293, Diocletian appointed a Caesar, basically a deputy, to each emperor, which was intended to resolve all of the succession uncertainty. This system was called the Tetrarchy. It is worth noting that Diocletian based himself in the east, which he clearly considered more important. The eastern Caesar was made responsible for the Balkans, and the western Caesar was based in Gaul, but given a focus on difficult Britain. That Caesar was Constantius, and his son Constantine spent part of his childhood in Diocletian's court, possibly as a hostage or possibly as a surrogate son, since Diocletian only had a daughter, Valeria, who was married to his co-emperor Maximus. When Diocletian retired in 305 after ruling for 22 years, the system of orderly succession appeared to work. The 2 Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, became emperors, and Constantine joined his father on a campaign in Britain. However, Constantius soon died in York, and his army commanders proclaimed Constantine his successor. Actually, this proclamation was a serious interference with the official line of succession, since Constantine should have been succeeded by Severus, who had been appointed Caesar in 305. Still, Galerius was willing to avoid a civil war, so he recognized Constantine as Caesar with responsibility for Britain and Gaul, while Severus was emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Okay, the system of orderly succession had faced its first test, and it had passed. Admittedly, barely. Actually, the situation soon became a bit complicated. While many people look forward to retirement, some are reluctant to leave their job, unsure of how they will fill their newfound free time, or unwilling to abandon their authority. Unfortunately, the former co-emperor Maximus proved to be one of the latter and refused to resign. Instead, he and his son Maxentius soon gained control of Italy, Spain, and North Africa. Severus naturally marched to crush the revolt, but was defeated in 307 and died in prison a few months later. A new emperor was needed, so Galerius held a conference in 308 with Diocletian and Maximus. Licinius became emperor, Maximus retired, his son was declared an usurper, and Constantine remained Caesar. When Galerius died in 311, he should have been succeeded by his official co-emperor Licinius and his nephew Maximum, who had been made Caesar. Although Maximus had died a year earlier before Galerius, his son Maxentius believed that he had inherited his father's claim to the throne. War between Constantine and Maxentius was unavoidable, or more accurately, neither man wanted to avoid it. Fortunately, Licinius was busy dealing with Maximin, who felt that emperor sounded better than Caesar, so he approved of Constantine's campaign and even married Constantine's half-sister, Constantia. The civil war between Constantine and Maxentius lasted for over a year, but Maxentius died in battle on October 28, 312. Constantine had become the unchallenged ruler of the Western Empire, and he had become a Christian, although the degree of his faith is debatable. Given the number of sun gods among religions, he was probably comfortable with the general concept, and he clearly saw no purpose in the persecution of Christians. At the same time, there was no advantage in angering the followers of the numerous pagan religions, so he maintained a praiseworthy tolerance towards all religions. So, would Constantine be satisfied with half of an empire? He met Licinius in early January 313 in Milan to answer that exact question. It is unknown if they could have negotiated a relatively amicable division of the empire, but it was possible. However, the negotiations ended when Maximin broke an existing truce with Licinius, who naturally expressed his regrets to his fellow emperor and hurried east to deal with Maximin. When the two rivals met in the end of April, Maximin was defeated and committed suicide. In theory, the two emperors should have existed peacefully since the empire had already been divided in two, but they were at war by the following summer. The fighting favored Constantine, so Licinius handed over the Balkans. Peace proved temporary, and Constantine was the aggressor in June 323. Licinius fought, but lost and surrendered. A few months later, Constantine ordered the murder of Licinius, making him the sole emperor, thus ending the brief life of the Tetrarchy. Recognizing that the sprawling empire would be difficult to govern, Constantine attempted to use Christianity to unite his empire, although, again, the degree of his personal piety is debatable. Having experienced periods of persecution, the church was decentralized, which naturally led to different perspectives. Most of those new perspectives merely annoyed other Christians. However, a new interpretation of a key element of the Christian faith appeared in Egypt, where a young priest named Arius taught that Jesus of Nazareth was not fully divine and therefore not equal to his Father. The empire could not be united under a single religion if that religion failed to remain united. Hoping to reconcile the different interpretations, Constantine offered every bishop in the empire an all-expenses paid trip to a council at the city of Nicaea, which began on May 20th, 325. Constantine hoped that if everyone was in the same room, the bishops would find a reasonable compromise. Unfortunately, faith and reasonable compromises do not always go together. No matter, Constantine had united an empire, admittedly by killing his rivals, but he felt that he could unite a room packed with bishops. The Arians, the followers of Arius, used the Greek word homoiousios to describe Jesus of Nazareth. The word translated as of like substance, thus stating that Jesus was not equal to his Father. Constantine proposed a compromise, replacing the Arian term homoiousios with homoousios, which meant of the same substance. The two words are extremely similar, one just has another letter I. Amazing. The removal of a single letter resolved a fierce debate over faith. Well, that is why he was the emperor. Actually, that is the point. Constantine was the emperor, and he did not have a good track record with public opposition, so the Arian bishops smiled politely, nodded their acceptance, and left the council. Problem solved. Oh, Arius was condemned and his books were ordered to be burnt. The interpretation proposed by the emperor would be called the Nicene Creed, since it had been introduced at Nicaea and is still used in Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox churches today. The problem with faith, or more accurately, the power of faith, is that people believe strongly, and the Arians' belief in their interpretation proved to be much stronger than the emperor's face-saving compromise. Arius continued to preach in Egypt, and the number of his followers grew until their interpretation proved strong enough to survive Arius' death. By this time, Constantine was preoccupied with planning a war against the Persians, but he died on the way, and then his heirs were too busy fighting over the throne to devote much energy to a religious debate. However, the empire continued to be too large to be ruled by a single emperor, so the Eastern Emperor was based in Constantinople, formerly known as Byzantium, while the Western Emperor was based in Trier to deal with the borders in Gaul. The division of the empire into two brought a degree of internal stability, but the borders would soon be stressed by migrations of tribes desperate to find safety. If the many Germanic tribes had remained small tribes as likely to feud with each other as test the Roman border, the situation would have been manageable. However, the smaller tribes began to merge and form larger groupings like the Goths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Gepids, the Saxons, the Alemanni, and the Franks. As a result, during the early to mid-4th century, Roman emperors would send an army into barbarian territory to defeat one of the new, larger tribal confederations and receive the submission of the king, if he survived, otherwise his successor. These punitive expeditions would remind the neighboring kings that the Roman Empire remained mighty. Young men might be recruited directly into the army, and the kings would be convinced to join attacks on other tribes, although the prospect of loot probably made the argument easy. Defeated tribes might be forced to hand over food supplies as compensation for the cost of the punitive expedition, and likely hand over hostages. A functioning empire could easily manage this situation. It had the wealth to supply professional armies for long campaigns, and then offer financial benefits to encourage submission. Even large tribal confederations could not match the empire's ability to fund war. Again, I need to stress the key point: a functioning empire. Once the revolts and the coups within the empire increased in frequency, the empire ceased to function properly. It is worth mentioning that the rivers Rhine and Danube had fortifications along the borders, but the borders were long and the fortifications were only as effective as the number of soldiers assigned to the fortifications. They would not keep out barbarians if they were empty. Still, they were effective for centuries. Basically, a series of generations grew up with a clear understanding of where the empire ended. Also, it is worth pointing out that the Germanic client kingdoms probably viewed their fellow Germanic kingdoms as foreign rivals, not members of a pan-Germanic people. Unlike the Sasanian dynasty in Persia, there do not appear to have been attempts to unite the Goths, the Gepids, the Burgundians, and the Franks into a greater kingdom that could resist the Roman Empire. Instead, they all happily allied with the empire against their neighbors whenever it seemed convenient or financially lucrative. Moreover, the client kingdoms seem to have adopted more efficient farming and manufacturing techniques from the empire, which led to a population increase which eventually gave them the numbers to overwhelm the Roman borders. To sum up, the Roman Empire had expanded until the Mediterranean became a Roman lake. However, the empire failed to produce a stable succession system. After generations of bloody revolts, a general named Diocletian seized power in 283 and divided the empire into the western half and the eastern half, recognizing that it was too large to be ruled by a single emperor. Despite his best efforts, a civil war broke out soon after his death, and Constantine had become sole emperor by 323. Byzantium became his capital in order to better deal with the expansionist Sasanian dynasty in Persia. When he died, the empire was divided again. However, the Germanic tribes were pressing against the northern borders, and I will discuss one tribe's attempts to enter the empire next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.